Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome to all of you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where in the world you are. It's a pleasure for me to invite you to this very exciting new webinar. Today, we're going to talk about area-based management tools and marine protected areas in the context of the new treaty to manage biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. To do that, we have a very exciting and competent group of people who will be speaking for us. And what I'll do is I'll introduce them one at a time before their presentations, and then the two panelists who are also going to join us for this final question and answer session. The idea behind these seminars is really to give people an opportunity to better understand where are we when it comes to the treaty and the different parts to it. So this is the third one in a series which we're doing. The first one was on genetic resources. The second one was on environmental impact assessment, and then this third one is on MPAs and ABMTs. So the intent for us is really to give you an opportunity to ask questions. So already now, if you have burning questions you're interested in, feel free to look at the question panel and put in your questions, and you'll be able to get us to consider those. And we'll try to manage as many as we can, and we have about 45 minutes to run these questions. So hopefully we will be able to address as many as possible. And for those of you who might not get a chance to get their questions answered, please feel free also to give us feedback. We will send out a link to this recording, and we will also have an opportunity to give you a feedback form that you can give some suggestions for potential future webinars. We're also intending to have a fourth session, which will cover the topic of financial mechanism, capacity building, and institutional issues. Depending a little bit on demand, we might do additional ones apart from these, and perhaps do those a little bit closer to the next round of negotiation, which is now scheduled to happen beginning of January. So today, all of us, I think, have heard about the whole idea that we should be protecting 30% of the world ocean and finding a mechanism for doing that. And of course, when we're dealing with the high seas, these are very large areas. Currently, we don't have so many cases, but we will hear from a couple of these cases here of how we're trying to go about doing this conservation. But in order to give a bit of a framework one would address these type of issues, I'm very, very happy to introduce to you apart from that, she's also a great fun person to talk to, and someone who really is easy to understand when it comes to the insights about how do we go about structuring this treaty. Now, beyond that, she's also working in with the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, DOSI, which is a co-organizer of this, as well as the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative, the Sargasso Sea Project, and the High Seas Alliance. And recently, she also became a member of the Executive Planning Group for the UN Decade of Ocean. So Christina will fill us in on the treaty and give us a bit of a sense of where are we going with these things, and how should we think about the topics related to area-based management tools. Christina, the floor is yours. You're still muted, Christina. We need you unmuted as well. Sorry.
Okay, are you seeing the presentation? Yes. Okay.
Not yet the presentation. We just see you right now.
I have not gotten a share screen request.
Okay, sorry about that. See, can you?
While we're waiting for this, I will say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. Okay, I think we should be on board now. Let me know when you can see the screen.
Yes, we can see your screen now. You're ready to go.
Lovely. Okay, so it's my pleasure to try to give a oversight, a 30,000 feet oversight of where we are today in terms of negotiating this new treaty for areas beyond national jurisdiction. What I'm trying to do is to bring us all up onto a level playing field with respect to opportunities and challenges in moving beyond our current status quo. For those who are new to this, we call it sometimes the BBNJ Treaty. This is the shorthand for the UN Treaty on the Conservation, Sustainable Use of Marine Biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And the focus has been for many of us on how do you better implement the principles and obligations set forth in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, including, of course, the general obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment, to protect and preserve rare and fragile ecosystems and habitats of species, and to cooperate on a global and regional basis. But we're also finding that as the world expands in terms of populations, stressors, and climate change, that we may also need to evolve to confront current and future challenges. So where we are today, excuse me, is in a draft agreement the President issued in November that's containing 12 parts, and part 3 is on area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. That's not to say the other parts are less important, they're just not our focus today, but they include on marine genetic resources, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building, as well as larger questions about financial institutions and general principles and approaches. So here we are, the steps going through what is in the treaty to date, outline definitions in part 1, and then skipping to part 3, you have the objectives, 15, international cooperation and coordination, on down and up and around to monitoring and review. These are the classic stages for an MPA proposal within national jurisdiction. And now we're also trying to address the challenge of other area-based management tools. So I'm fortunate to be able to build off the results of many minds coming together in Glan last October. That's where we're able to brainstorm where are we today and where might we want to go in the future. You'll be hearing from, of course, Guillermo Ortuño Crespo and David Freestone, and Jorge Jimenez a little bit about the real on-the-ground case studies about tools, technologies, and places that we're actually trying to come to grapple with in this new treaty. So the title, which we chose as sort of the conclusion, is It's Time to Build Ambition, Broaden Participation, and Plan Ahead. And how we might do that is what I'm going to try to talk in these 3 sections today. Is future-proofing starts with definitions and objectives, specifically for marine protected areas, as well as other area-based management tools. 2, steps for enhancing cooperation, coordination, and action. I think we really need to be looking towards implementation mechanisms. And then 10 steps for future-proofing this draft BBNJ treaty to deal with the challenges of the future. So what is a marine protected area and why is this important? Well, as you can see, the dark blue in the corner, it talks about, this is an IUCN standard that has been applied to marine protected areas around the world to provide a uniform definition and tracking and tracing of progress as we try to move beyond that 10% target that governments agreed in 2002. But the main point here is that the essential characteristics that an MPA needs to have to be an MPA globally is the conservation focused, with nature as the priority. That with a management plan and the resources and capacity to effectively implement it. But what it means in practice is that conservation is the primary objective. Sustainable use is what you're trying to do outside. And I think it's building on decades of experience also in the Convention on Biological Diversity, whereas in 1992, they already realized that you needed to elaborate what does it actually mean to protect and preserve the marine environment? What does it mean to conserve and sustain marine biodiversity? And here they actually set forth a process that included both system of MPAs, system of other perhaps sectoral measures taken to conserve marine biodiversity, but also looking at your approach to managing biodiversity as a whole, which includes managing biological resources within and without marine protected areas so that they're sustainable. Outside the MPAs, promote protection of ecosystems, habitats, and species, not just in MPAs, but also beyond. And then promoting environmentally sound, compatible development adjacent, sort of like a buffer zone. And then, of course, the overarching need, which is to regulate and manage its processes and activities to avoid significant adverse impacts. Now, so what are we talking about when we talk about types of marine protected areas? Well, we have the classic marine protected areas with multiple categories. IUCN has 6, but here the one that many are talking about, because it's the most sure of securing long-term protection and resilience in the time of climate change, is the marine reserve, where areas are reserved for science, for wilderness values, and not for extractive. There's also another category that talks about sustainable use inside of an MPA. And if you look into the actual guidelines and standards, they're talking about small scale use that is compatible with the primary objective of conservation. And then, of course, there are recognized needs to have special measures for habitat and species protection. But currently, MPAs are one type of area-based management tool. Most of these are sectoral in nature and only cover one specific threat from one specific sector. For example, PSSAs deal with shipping. APEIs are still a provisional measure for areas of particular environmental interest that would be off limits to exploration of mineral resources in the area, hoping that those become a more permanent fixture. Vulnerable marine ecosystems are off limits only to deep sea bottom fishing, contact fishing, and those are designated when there's a concern, a likely potential for an impact that would be significantly adverse, and hence the area is closed off in anticipation in order to avoid those significant adverse impacts. Moving on, looking into the future, what I'm hoping we'll start to talk about is the need for a flexible approach in the draft agreement to truly recognize the need for globally recognized, designated, and potentially managed area-based management tools that go beyond a marine protected area. For example, in the Pacific region, you already have this concept of an oceanscape. Can we start to really look at how you start to manage wider activities, bring everybody on board? You need your buffer zones around marine protected areas, dynamic migratory corridors. Guillermo will talk about that a little bit more, but reporting is a fairly simple requirement to request states to actually inform you when they're coming near an area, coming near a potential vulnerable area, so that you can get them the latest information on environmental concerns, and of course the need to be looking forward. The relevance for the objective section of the treaty is, again, conservation is the dominant priority, and looking towards the whole focus of the treaty, the added value of the treaty is to create that network of MPAs, create that global mandate to protect, maintain, and restore biological diversity and ecosystem integrity. The difference, special component about MPA is that they are managed subject to a management plan. So it's not just ad hoc, one sector at a time, but it's comprehensive. And the primary role here would be at the global, with support from the sectoral and regional. When you get to the other area-based management tools, yes, there is definitely a role for tools that can promote sustainable use. But these can be both ad hoc, like the vulnerable marine ecosystems are, or systematic, trying to look at where are your migratory corridors, where are your hotspots in the marine environment that may just be subject to a single stressor that needs to be addressed. And again, this needs to carry forward that obligation to protect and specially manage ecosystems, habitats, and species outside of marine protected areas. And here the roles are sectoral, regional, as well as global. Moving forward, and how do you actually start to create platforms for cooperation to enhance coordination and action, looking more specifically at Articles 15, 19, and 20. That's moving forward, the President's draft text envisages this bifurcated roles where your primary obligation is to promote coherence, which is relatively vague and may be hard to measure actually how much progress you're making. The aim is to promote coherence first through relevant bodies and then through this agreement, and only where there are no other relevant bodies to adopt, complementary measures, and only when there is no body to adopt marine protected areas and adopt measures. Some are even suggesting that there should be an obligation to establish a new body for management where there is not one. But then it puts onto states parties the onus to make these arrangements for consultation to enhance cooperation and coordination. Suggestions stemming from the Area-Based Management Tools workshop are really about the states parties do have a direct obligation and should have a direct obligation to promote the adoption of marine protected areas and other area-based management tools directly and through their membership in existing bodies, based on this duty to protect and preserve. The important thing to note is that many states who care about biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction are not parties to regional fisheries management organizations, may not be able to send people to the International Maritime Organization in London or Kingston, Jamaica for the ISA. So this is a chance for all states to have a say in the future of our ocean. And in terms of platforms for cooperation to actually help to implement the obligations to cooperate, looking forward to really building on that Conference of Parties role to make it a more active facilitator. And then in terms of decision making, which parallels 15, is the Conference of Parties shall or may still to be determined. Establishment of ABMTs is only where there are existing bodies. Again, it bifurcates this role, and the power of the Conference of Parties only comes to play where there is no other existing body. An alternative approach is really to enable the Conference of Parties to take active decisions to establish MPAs, adopt management plans, establish other ABMTs, to have this consultation process first to bring all states and organizations on board, but for the power, the inherent power of a state to adopt conservation measures to state parties and then to recommend other area-based management tools. And how we're sort of envisaging this allocation of responsibility is really looking at what we already have, is that fishing, shipping, states involved and organizations, their obligation under the Convention on Biological Diversity and under existing international law is truly to integrate biodiversity considerations into their management and to manage to avoid significant harm. That's SDG 14.2. But the components of biodiversity are something much different. Even the Convention on Biological Diversity treats them differently. We all have a collective responsibility to manage, sustain, and protect those components of biodiversity, both through measures of in situ conservation, but also throughout their range. And this can be done through processes and activities that are under national jurisdiction and control, coordinated through this Conference of Parties. This is the place where you can come together to actually say, this is the will that we are directing to manage the components of biological diversity, and leave the fishing and shipping organizations responsible for managing their specific activities, but with the benefits of additional knowledge about biodiversity, about ecosystems, about threats and stressors to really help them do their job. So this is looking at potential institutional arrangements. The Global Conference of Parties, everybody has agreed on, and we're talking about making arrangements for cooperation and coordination. One of the things that we've learned about is sort of informal, formal platforms for biodiversity collaboration could take many different roles. They're not going to take away the role of the sectoral organization responsible for managing activities, but they're going to try to bring together those who are concerned about the activities and those who are concerned about the biodiversity. And for example, the possible roles might be the dedicated implementation arm, just as the Convention on Biological Diversity looked to regional seas organizations to implement the CBD at a regional level. But the important part is that it's devolved powers and authorities from the Conference of Parties to actually try to proceed, and answerable, of course, to the Conference of Parties, but to create a level playing field for both biodiversity interests and activity interests. It could be ad hoc at first. Perhaps the simple addition of the Conference of Parties may make arrangements for collaboration, consultation is sufficient. But the point is it's open to all states, organizations, and other sectors with an interest in biodiversity collaboration, and not just those who are parties to the sectoral organizations, because biodiversity truly is a concern of all. So moving towards the end, really just to wrap up, the 10 enabling conditions that we're really looking at for a future-proofed new treaty is to recognize that the global ocean is a common concern, common responsibility. Its biodiversity is a common interest of all, that we can all benefit from better management, from better science, from better collaboration. That's, we can build capacity for all. But to do this, we need to enable nimble measures by not foreclosing opportunities for these future type of MPAs. We need to be ensuring access and improving access to data, monitoring, and information from all players who are out at sea, as well as the future UN Decade of Ocean Science, and to provide these robust institutional elements that can take us forward to the next 30 years. And then finally, just to focus on really defining the specific conservation obligations, not just protect and preserve, but this is an opportunity to actually say, this means in situ conservation, this means protection of habitat species, to recognize the interconnectivities, both ecological, oceanographic, as well as cultural. Establish clear requirements for precaution. David will get into that, incorporating existing definitions, standards, what is an MPA, what is not. And fundamentally, we need to strengthen the existing bodies we have, but to recognize the limits in their mandate, as well as the limits in their sphere, and the need to be able to pull all of us together in the same canoe as we are going forward. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. I'm looking forward to questions. And if there's further desire for information, here are some sites to look forward to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Christina. I think that was very enlightening. I always learn a lot when I listen to Christina. And, you know, despite the fact that we've had dialogues about this now for many, many years, this is an evolving field. And I think all of us feel that we need to learn and understand it better. So I would encourage you all to ask the questions you might have to Christina, put them in the question box, and then when we continue with the dialogue of all of us, we will have an opportunity to try to address as many of those as possible. So thank you very much, Christina. And I will ask Dr. David Freestone, who is a visiting scholar and adjunct professor at George Washington University Law School, to come on board and share your screen. There we have David. Excellent. So David is also running the Sargasso Sea project since 2010, and he's currently the executive secretary of the Sargasso Sea Commission, which was established pursuant to the 2014 Hamilton Declaration on Collaboration for the Conservation of the Sargasso Sea. So the idea here is to really get a case study. What would an area-based management tool look like in the high seas? And this is one of the first attempts at getting to that. And I think it's a very exciting example, because for many of us, the high seas is basically the place when we're flying across the Atlantic that we look at 2.5 movies on, and we actually barely look out the window. So very few of us have a real relationship to it. Whereas I think the Sargasso Sea is in fact a place which, you know, many of us have some notion of, but we don't really understand it. We didn't really have the real sense of it. And here we have an opportunity to, I think, learn from David how we have picked this area, what are the types of conservation measures that can be put in place, and how would we fit new treaty on area-based management tool to address the types of challenges we have in the Sargasso Sea. So without further ado, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carl, and great pleasure to be here, and welcome to my welcome to all the participants. I think we have a very healthy audience, so we're absolutely delighted. I've only got a few minutes, so I've got to always have too many slides, so I'm going to move through it fairly quickly. A little word about where it is and why it's important. Initially, it's the northern subtropical gyre, which actually holds, so that's the currents of North Atlantic subtropical gyre hold the Sargassum into this fairly tight area here around Bermuda, and Bermuda is the only land territory within it. It's the only sea without a coast, really, except for the islands of Bermuda. And this is the area which the signatories to the Declaration on Collaboration for the Conservation of the Sargasso Sea, which I'll be talking a little bit about, have designated as the area of collaboration. There are 10 government signatories now to that declaration, and I should say that I'm speaking on my own behalf, and that of the Commission, not on behalf of them. I don't represent their views; they have very strong views themselves. So the aim of the Sargasso Sea project, which is now 10 years old, is led by the government of Bermuda, and it was threefold: to achieve international recognition of the importance of the Sargasso Sea, and to work with existing international and sectoral organizations to achieve better protection in accordance with the Law of the Sea Convention. So this is 10 years ago. We were still having an ad hoc group on BBNJ. We hadn't moved to the stage we have now with the negotiation of an actual text. So this was just it's like a testing ground, and when we see how we could use those experiences as an indication of what's possible and what's not possible. So why is it important? It's been called the golden floating rainforest of the North Atlantic. It's important from a legal point of view because it's actually no organization that has, and if I'm just using my pointer here, this is NIAF, the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Organization. This is NAFO, Northwest, and then this is the Sargasso Sea here. So there is no regional fisheries organization that governs this area. ICAT has responsibility for tunas, for the whole tuna-like species, for the whole of the Atlantic. And in the Northeast Atlantic, we also have an environmental organization, OSPAR, which is virtually the same area. Nothing here. So this is an area which is something of a legal vacuum. It's also important because it's a unique system. It's a sargassum based on the floating seaweed, which reproduces. It's holopelagic. It reproduces without contact with the ground. And if you float anything in the ocean, fish come and sit underneath it. So it has actually a very important role in the life history of a lot of species. Turtles, it's the areas where they spend their many famous lost years. They just seem to disappear into the Atlantic. This is where they find this nurturing environment. Also tuna fish, billfishes, sharks, and it's only the only place in the world where the European eels spawn. We'll say a bit about that later. These are some of the endemic. So this is just to give you an idea of this flavor of this very special ecosystem in the middle of the Atlantic. Iconic species, whales, billfishes, turtles, and tunas. Even the famous bluefins move through it, although they didn't actually spawn in the Sargasso Sea, we think. And as I said, this nurturing environment, tiny turtles are actually find their way in, they find this haven there, but also fishes, flying fish actually spawn and attach their eggs to the sargassum. So it's a very special place. This is just a quick picture of the anguillid eels. The European and the North American eels actually spawn in this area just south, we think, of Bermuda here. And we only know this by having found their larvae, the leptocephali, and these are the indications of how big they are when we find them, so, or where they have been found, 10 millimeters and 15 millimeters, so very small guys. I think maybe the actual spawning takes place maybe even slightly more to the east. So the eels live in fresh brackish water. They maturity from 20 years on or so, they swim 4,000 miles to this area for reasons we have no idea, and then they spawn in this, and the larvae hatch in these areas here. And then they find their way back. The European eels find their way back to Europe, and the American eels find their way back to Canada, to the US, and to some of the islands of the Caribbean, the big ones with rivers. All ocean areas are subject to threats. So I just point this up for you: pollution, garbage, plastic, perhaps overfishing, harvesting, sargassum. exotics, as well as ocean acidification, climate change, etc. So in 2014, we were actually able to pull together a number of governments to sign the Hamilton Declaration. So this is a non-binding political commitment to collaborate for the conservation of the Sargasso Sea. We had originally 5 government signatories. We now have 10. And we have a number of governments who have been very supportive over the years, as well as those signatories. So the Azores, Bahamas, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, Canada, the Cayman Islands, Dominican Republic, Monaco, UK, and the United States. And in addition, Netherlands, Sweden, South Africa, Turks and Caicos Islands, and Portugal have also been very supportive, as well as a number of organizations that have worked with us. The structure that's established is fairly loose, a meeting of the signatories as required. Usually try to do this once a year. And the Sargasso Sea Commission is unusual in that it's independent. They're volunteers who are appointed by the government of Bermuda on the nomination of the signatory governments who serve in their personal capacity. So I say again, I'm speaking on their behalf, not on behalf of the signatories. We have a financial mechanism both in the US and in Bermuda, and then a very small secretariat, lean and mean. As I said, it's 2 of us. And that's the current commission. We started off by doing a baseline environmental science agreement. So I'll give you some idea of the sort of impact of the importance of this. A lot of collaboration, 74 collaborators from 10 countries, 11 science organizations, many of which you'll recognize from these logos like Woods Hole and the Southampton National Oceanographic Center and others. So that was approved, actually through the Bermuda cabinet and then to the UK government, was approved before we moved forward. Bermuda, I should say, is self-governing, but it is still an overseas territory of the UK. And our first success was to actually have it described as an EBSA, an ecologically biologically significant area, after a workshop in Brazil in 2012, and then it was agreed by the Conference of the Parties in that same year. And this is not a legal definition. It has no legal connotations. It's merely a description, a science-based process which identifies this area as being of ecological or biological significance, which should be quite an important part of the process. So that's 8 years ago. We've also were the only named ecosystem in the first ocean assessment in 2015, and we've already got the second one going, and we've already finished our draft. So it's the only named ecosystem. The others are coral reefs and seagrass beds, etc. The Sargasso Sea is the only sort of geographically identified area in the assessment. We've been working with all those competent organizations which have impinge on this area. NAFO, for example, they can see the area of competence of the West Atlantic. This is the Bermuda EZ, and this is our EBSA here, and these are the seamounts, the corner seamounts and the seamounts around there. And in 2015, NAFO, as a result of a proposal put forward on our behalf by 2 of the signatory governments, closed those seamounts. They already were probably closed, but they had a full investigation and closed them completely. And they also banned the use of gear, middle water trawling gear, which might touch the bottom. So respecting the fact that these are vulnerable marine ecosystem, the VMEs that Christina just talked of. The other fishing organization is a rather bigger and rather more difficult organization to work with, ICAT. We commissioned a study in 2011 which showed this is it's like a fish, but this is actually the fishing effort in these areas. Very low fishing. Dark blue is no fishing effort at all. Light blue is some effort. The red lips of the fish are actually probably the US swordfish fleet, and a little bit of possibly IUU fishing going on over here, but nothing within the Bermuda EZ, no commercial fishing, and this is all fairly low aspects. So we've done a lot of work with the ICAT through their ecosystem subcommittee. We got a mandate in 2012 to actually look into this. It wasn't quite as strong as we'd hoped, but to look at data and information concerning the Sargasso Sea. We've actually produced most of that. And then in 2016, we actually got some agreement from the 17, isn't it? From the full commission to actually look at the issues of ecosystem-based fisheries management. We'd actually proposed that the Sargasso Sea be regarded as a pilot for an ecosystem-based fisheries approach. That wasn't agreed by the parties, but we've been looking into the information about it, and we've actually just this year in a virtual meeting of the subcommittee, it was agreed that we would be a pilot. So we've been going there for now 10 years, and that's the result of what we've managed to achieve. It's not a lot, it's something, but it's not a lot. Remember, there is an obligation on ICAT as well as the other bodies to under the Fish Stocks Agreement of 1995, so that's a long time ago, to implement ecosystem-based approach on a precautionary approach as well. In the meantime, the area of low fishing, we can see this is from Ocean Mine, that the area of fishing, the amount of fishing has actually increased. So there's a summary of those 3 years up to 2018 shows, to 2017 shows actually the red is actually fairly heavy areas. And last year we actually, Global Fishing Watch did this, captured this snap for us, and it shows that we've actually, it's now an area of quite increasing fishing effort. So we've kind of lost the opportunity. We had an area which would have been fairly easily to put conservation measures in, which we have probably lost that opportunity because we're now talking about displacement. So, you know, that's an indication. IMO has been is also fairly difficult. Remember, IMO has a lot of options available for ABMTs, smart port special areas, routing measures, reporting, ballast water controls, etc. All within the context of the PSSA, the particularly sensitive sea area that Christina talked of. Again, we've looked at possible measures in relation to IMO. In the meantime, increased vessel traffic. You may be aware that since 1990, vessel traffic has increased 300% globally, and with the opening of the widened Panama Canal, this has happened with the Sargasso Sea, and that's 1 month in December 2018. Again, Global Fishing Watch, the number of vessels over 100 meters long. So these are big guys, and that's an area of open ocean. So what are the lessons that we've learned from this? This is a paper that Christina and I did some 2016. 10 years we've been doing this, and it's not an easy task. Remember that the Law of the Sea Convention and the 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement provide a fairly strong mandate. Christina already talked about the obligations of Article 194, Paragraph 7, to talk about protection of fragile ecosystems and habitats. We had the mandate for an ecosystem approach in the Fish Stocks Agreement and for a precautionary approach, which means that you don't have to prove damage, you have to show the high likelihood of damage. So the tools are available, but they're not being used. I think, NAFO is probably an exception in that it's closed off these areas that we were talking about. It's closed off its seamount areas as VME, but it's meeting the requirements of the VME requirements of the resolutions, and it's also beginning to adopt an ecosystem-based approach to its fisheries. ICAT's still a long way away from that. So we're now into, how many years are we after the 25 years since the 1995 Fish Stock Agreement mandated this? IMO, there are no high seas PSSAs. There are very few special areas as well in high seas, Southern Ocean, Mediterranean, which are kind of unique systems. Most of the protection measures there are associated with this, which are required for a PSSA, are safety-based. They go through the Marine Safety Committee rather than Marine Environmental Protection Committee. So areas to be avoided, routing measures, etc. So the system isn't oriented towards the protection of the environment and to biodiversity in the way that we're seeking to advocate. So again, Commission's view on this is that we've got these legal obligations in place and it's not enough. Persuasion and peer pressure has not really been enough to persuade the parties to these sectoral agreements to actually take measures. Christina mentioned the provisions of decision making in Article 9, and the COP really has power of decision, but only where there is no existing organization. So there is always a global organization in relation to seabed mining. There's always an global organization in relation to vessel transport, because the IMO, the global, and also all the tuna fishing is already covered by this network of tuna fishing arrangements. So we think that's not been enough. So we think that it shouldn't just be a bottom line when there's a vacuum, but we think that the Conference of the Parties should have that power consultation and collaboration. But if that doesn't happen, there should be that bottom line. We should be looking at 30% by 2030. That's going to take a lot of decision making. The good news is we've just won a GF grant. First, it's a $3 million grant. The first one for a multi-sectoral high seas project. But we've been running for 10 years and we've had financial problems over the years. So the other issue for us to look at, maybe not today, but in one of your future webinars, is that we think that the setting up of new arrangements or networks which are envisaged by the new agreement, there should be some financial mechanism for this. Otherwise, it's only going to be the developed countries and MPA who want to do this. So happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I think that was very enlightening, and I certainly learned a little bit more about the Sargasso Sea also, which is such a special place. And, you know, that's one of the reasons when we were thinking of how would we pick a couple of cases, we went for the Sargasso Sea because it is easier to define as an area. One of the problems we have in the high seas is, you know, why this area and why not some other areas? And I think you've been able to convincingly tell us why this is such a special area and why we need to do some very targeted efforts to protect it and find mechanisms. But as you're really rightfully pointing out, you know, the pressures are building, and even if it has been relatively okay so far, you know, there is a number of things looming on the horizon, and we still don't really have the entire arsenal of tools in place, and we certainly don't have the financial or long-term mechanisms in place to make sure this is working. So now let's move to the third presentation. And before I do that, also I should say, anyone who has any questions for David, please put them in through the question box, and we'll be very happy to try to address as many as possible. Our third and final speaker today is Dr. Guillermo Ortuño Crespo, and he's a marine spatial ecologist, and he just got his PhD from Duke University. And he's been working a lot on temporal overlap of high seas fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that's really part of what he will be talking about today. I mean, the whole topic of how can we look at temporal protection measures. So one of the problems, of course, is in dynamic systems like the ocean, you know, resources move, and we need to find mechanisms of actually protecting the functionality of these and seeing that that will work. So we're also happy to learn that Guillermo has made it back to Europe, and he's now heading up to my home country of Sweden. By the way, the Swedish government is the main sponsor of these set of webinars. And you will be at the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is an excellent institution, and I'm very happy that you will be joining the team up there shortly. So without further ado, Guillermo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carl. I look forward to moving to Sweden soon. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the previous presenters and for joining us in this very important presentation or presentation series on how we go about protecting what is essentially half of our planet. In today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on some of the details of how we design and implement area-based management tools for the high seas and the importance for the BBNJ Treaty to move beyond static spatial management and make use of the best available data and technologies to incorporate some of that dynamism that we know exists in the high seas. Much of the content in today's presentation is contained in on a scientific article which will soon be published in the journal Marine Policy. You have the title on the bottom of your screens if you want to look for it in the upcoming weeks. But essentially what I wanted to talk about today is that for many decades, the remoteness and dynamism of the high seas have posed very significant challenges for monitoring, research, management, and enforcement efforts. And during this time period where the high seas felt so distant and so hard to study and protect, human activities expanded and intensified significantly, not only shipping and fishing, as we've heard, but the laying of underwater cables, as well as deep sea mining, have grown quite significantly in 46% of our planet. We are now at a crossroads with this BBNJ treaty where there seems to be political will and advancements in technologies and our understanding of the open ocean now allow us not only to implement, enforce, and monitor area-based management tools, but have these reflect the true dynamism of the open ocean and face future challenges such as climate change. We have to monitor multiple activities in a constantly changing open ocean. I would like to use an analogy that we're all experiencing right now to discern between mitigation efforts that are currently taking place in the shipping and fishing sectors versus avoidance. If we are exposed to COVID in this situation that we're experiencing, we can reduce the risks by washing our hands, washing surfaces, or wearing face masks. That is assuming that you are going to be in close proximity to someone who potentially has the virus. Avoidance, on the other hand, is what we're doing right now. We're not overlapping in space and time, and that's why I don't have to talk to you with a face mask, because the risk has been reduced to zero by not sharing the same location in space and time. In the context, in this case of maritime fishing, we have focused our efforts on mitigation, changing how fishing practices take place, modifying fishing gears, for instance, but the use of spatial management of ABMTs essentially to avoid the risk has not really taken place or kicked off in the high seas. We have some examples, but as I will go over, there are very, very few. I think the focus of spatial management should not be to exclude all activities, but to selectively allow for some, depending on the interests of each sector. In this case, in the context of fishing again, we want to allow the overlap of the stressor of fishing activities with target biodiversity. We want these industries to catch tunas and billfish within a quota system, but we want to minimize their overlap with non-target biodiversity or your bycatch species. This is not to say that, that fishing cannot coexist with area-based management tools, but more that it has to happen in a smart way that understands the distribution of each of these three components. And this is particularly hard in the high seas, where all these three move in what seem to be unpredictable ways, but thanks to technology and advancements in science, we can now predict them in the present and into the future. So what I will be suggesting here today is that we have to use the appropriate tools at the appropriate scales in order to manage the high seas spatially. And what I mean about appropriate scales are the three that you have on your screen. There is a spatial scale to area-based management tools, of course, but there is a temporal scale that, from my point of view, has not been covered in sufficient detail in the BBNJ negotiations, and as well as the taxonomic scale, where there seems to be some friction with existing instruments as to where the mandates lie and what biodiversity can be protected through BBNJ ABMTs versus, let's say, IMO ABMTs. So from my point of view, this first one has been adequately addressed in the current process, but the latter two, I think, need a little bit more work. To illustrate what I mean with the taxonomic footprint, I will lean on some of the data that is made available through the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, or OBIS. It is housed under the United Nations, and I believe currently represents the best source of information on the distribution of biodiversity in the high seas. They have recorded, the OBIS system has recorded up to 23,000 species in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the figure to your right, the map, it looks like a fairly comprehensive, that we have a fairly comprehensive understanding of where BBNJ occurs in the high seas. But if you look more closely, any pixel that is in light or dark blue represents a 100 by 100 kilometer cell, where we have only between 1 and 10 records in what is supposed to be, again, the most comprehensive biodiversity database. And any pixel in white is, again, a 100 by 100 kilometer cell where we have no data. So if we're trying to advance a conversation about area-based management tools in the high seas, and we were trying to protect, in this case, fish biodiversity that we know of 4,000 species or so in the high seas, the best data that we have in hand right now would not be sufficient to, let's say, establish an MPA or time area closure in the Indian Ocean or the Southeast Pacific. This is not to say that the data does not exist. Many countries have very valuable biodiversity information. They just haven't shared it with OBIS quite yet. And unless we make a conscious effort to widely share what each state knows about biodiversity in the high seas, we will have a very patchy understanding of BBNJ that I don't think will truly let us protect biodiversity through ABMTs. My sort of colleagues in the terrestrial realm who have to think about the conservation of giraffes or lions in the African savanna have a relatively easy job because they can afford to think in 2 spatial dimensions. You can identify a watering hole or an area of importance for these species, draw a static rectangle on a map, and that should suffice given the characteristics of the savanna. This sort of 2-dimensional static closures could also work for some benthic ecosystems. And we've seen a growing number of vulnerable marine ecosystems be identified. So to a certain extent, traditional terrestrial management approaches could work in the deep ocean. But what we're seeing because of climate change is that some of these closures will lose effectiveness over time as changing climatic conditions lead to a redistribution of biodiversity. When we think about biodiversity in the water column, in the open ocean, the story is much more complicated. And this is a type of dynamism that I don't think the current text captures just as well. We have to think not in 2 or 3, but 4 spatial and temporal dimensions to truly understand how biodiversity changes distribution across half of our planet. The shifts are horizontal and seasonal, or they could also be vertical and diurnal. So there's multiple spatial and temporal scales that come into play, and now we have a much better understanding of what factors may be driving these changes, and if we can predict those, dynamic area-based management tools become a reality. And again, this is something that perhaps 20 years ago, not having access to information or the knowledge could be not an excuse, but a legitimate reason. But nowadays, I think we do have the technology and tools to move forward with more complex and smarter area-based management tools. So the point I'm trying to get across in this presentation is that there is more to ABMTs than static MPAs, and that ABMTs should truly reflect the spatial and temporal variability of the species, habitats, or ecosystems they're trying to protect. And in this manuscript, we identify 4 different temporal scales that we encourage negotiators and different parties to consider. And I will go over them one by one very briefly. But before that, I wanted to give participants an understanding of the current state of affairs of area-based management tools, in this case, in tuna RFMOs. There are very few examples of fisheries closures in the high seas right now. They're all designed to reduce the catch of target species. They're quite informal, and some of them are voluntary. They're poorly enforced, and what worries me a lot is that they're static in space. They don't account for the changes in the oceanography or distribution of species as they should. Over the last few years, there's been a growing field known as dynamic ocean management, which tries to reflect this variability that we observe in the oceanography or distribution of species. They try to reflect that in the spatial management measures which are adopted. So as the oceanography changes and the species engage in the seasonal or annual migrations, the spatial management measures move with the areas that are most likely suitable habitat for target and non-target species. So in order to make this type of spatial management viable, we need a series of things, including observations here to the left of your screen, which, as you saw from OBIS, it is patchy for much of the non-target biodiversity in the high seas. And once you obtain those observations, you can process them using oceanographic information to establish a statistical relationship of where the animals are most likely to occur as oceanographic conditions change. So once you have these predictive models, you can use them to predict where, let's say, leatherback sea turtles will be next week based on the predictions of temperature next week, but also under climate change. And as climatological conditions change, our area-based management tools will also be able to change with the ocean. And I think that's the approach to spatial management that we should strive towards sectorally and cross-sectorally. This is the kind of work that I do as part of my research. I focus primarily on top predators and try to generate estimates of where they're most likely to occur. But just as you can do this for vertebrates, you can do it for invertebrates, pelagic and benthic, to really capture changes in distribution within and between years. So how do we monitor these dynamic ABMTs? We are struggling in some instances to monitor static ABMTs. So how do we go about monitoring closures that open and close throughout the year? As you saw from David's presentation, Global Fishing Watch is one of the many players in a growing field of monitoring human activities from space. This animation shows fishing effort in the global ocean using tracking fishing effort using AIS technology. It looks like we have a fairly good understanding at a global scale, but what I'm showing you on the screen is only the vessels that are equipped with AIS transponders. And not all fishing nations require their nationals to carry those transponders. Similarly, we could generate these maps to monitor maritime shipping and fishing again, but what we're seeing on the screen is not a true representation of human activities in the high seas on the global ocean. It is, again, just those vessels that are equipped with this type of transponder. And this is something that I think the BBNJ process should consider if we really want to understand where humans are with respect to biodiversity in the high seas. Global Fishing Watch, for instance, is trying to circumvent this gap in knowledge by using different technologies to map what they call, or what is generally known as the dark fleet, which does not transpond via AIS. So we have a series of tools at hand to try to get a good understanding of where the global fishing fleet is. But unless we have an understanding, as I showed in that previous Venn diagram, of where the stressor is with respect to biodiversity, we won't have the best information at hand to establish area-based management tools. For the temporal scales that I mentioned earlier, these are the four, and I'll explain them in a little bit more detail. The contemporary scale is primarily based on ephemeral features such as ocean eddies to the left of the screen and thermal fronts to the right of the screen. The squiggly lines that you see in the figure to the left are different ocean eddies that we were able to track from space using sea surface temperature and sea surface height information. And what's special about some of these eddies is that they aggregate biodiversity and are constantly redistributing BBNJ across ocean basins. So if we know where the eddies are and we can track them from space, we could potentially use ABMTs to prevent fishing effort, for instance, or maritime shipping to overlap with eddies that we believe are hosting vulnerable BBNJ. Intra-annual temporal scales are your monthly or seasonal processes. These are perhaps our best friends or the best friends of managers, since they're very reliable and predictable across years. A good example of this is the Costa Rica thermal dome, where we can pretty much predict how the dome will behave between months of July or December. This is the main temporal sort of frame or scale that it could be used for seasonal closures of shipping or fishing. This conversation gets a little bit more complicated when we look at inter-annual temporal scales, which are semi-predictable, and I would like for the audience to think about these as shocks to the system. The figure to the right shows the El Niño Southern Oscillation and changes in sea surface temperature depending on the phase of this climatic cycle. Since these are not periodic, they are hard to predict, but if you establish an ABMT during one of the El Niño phases that could last as long as 7 years, and you use the best available signs, the best available information, and then the cycle switches to La Niña, you could see a massive redistribution of biodiversity that essentially deems your ABMT ineffective if the features that you were trying to protect suddenly move outside of the square that you drew on the map. And finally, the last temporal scale that we encourage delegates to consider is multi-decadal. And this is referring to specifically to climate change, as we expect that changes in climatological conditions will affect the abundance, the vertical and horizontal distribution, phenology, size, behavior, extinction risk, and predator-prey relationships of BBNJ. So unless ABMTs have the capacity to account for some of these changes and move as biodiversity is being redistributed, as we saw in the previous paper that I showed in the Northeast Atlantic, these closures that have been that have taken a lot of time and effort to establish will not be effective. I would like to wrap up by just reminding participants that the open ocean and open ocean species and ecosystems do not stop at the EEZ boundaries, and that there is a lot of transboundary connectivity linking the high seas to national waters, coastal ecosystems, and coastal communities. And unless we are able to monitor biodiversity across these jurisdictional boundaries, if the right ABMTs are not placed in international waters, it is coastal communities and coastal ecosystems that may experience the worst effects, especially under climate change. So I know it's a complicated matter in the BBNJ process, but transboundary connectivity, perhaps transboundary area-based management tools are something that sooner or later I think we will have to address. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I will leave these final thoughts on the screen, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the panel.
Thank you very much indeed, Guillermo. I think you covered a number of different challenges there. I think we all know that the ocean is vast and there's many different things that need to be considered. And I think you pointed out really many of the ones that are perhaps most difficult to address at this point. But the good news is the tools are developing every year, and we are getting better and better at doing these things. So I think it's going to be down to a will to deal with it, and dealing with a dark fleet, dealing with various of the illegal activities that are going on in the high seas, and finding mechanisms for addressing them. So I would now invite all of the speakers and our two panelists to put on your videos and unmute yourself. And I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our two panelists. So we have Professor Jorge Jimenez, and he's Director General for Marviva, and he's been doing that for the last 13 years. Marviva is a regional nonprofit organization that promotes conservation and sustainable use of coastal and marine ecosystem in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. Jorge has specialized in marine ecology, and he's developed a lot of different things related to marine spatial planning, wetland conservation, biodiversity and inventories, and he's written over 100 peer-reviewed papers in all kinds of journals around the world. He's also acted as visiting professor at institutions in the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And our second panelist is Staffan Danielsson, who is the head of section at the Natural Environment Division of the Ministry of Environment, Land and Natural Resources of the Government of Sweden. And for those of you who were here last week for our EIA, he was also speaking in that one. So the good news is we have a lot of excellent questions that have already come in. So you've all been quite busy, and several of them, of course, are addressing the three presentations we just had. But I would also invite, for those of you who have not written in any questions right now, feel free to do so. We have a crack team that are helping us. Simi Payne and Aurélie Spadon are reviewing them and helping me to moderate also in terms of finding the appropriate ones. So I wanted to start with another case study that I think is really interesting, and that's looking at the Eastern Tropical Pacific and addressing this one to Jorge. There is the Costa Rica Dome. Can you tell us, I know you worked a lot on that one. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of what's actually the challenges there, and where you think addressing conservation in this area is going right now, and how would that fit within the treaty? So those are several questions, and I also would ask all of our panelists and speakers to be relatively short.
Yeah. Thank you, Carl. Yes, the Costa Rica Dome is an upwelling area that is located in front of the Central American Pacific coast. It's mostly located in the high seas, but because of the dynamic nature that it has, it moves from EEZ to the high seas and expands into the EEZs of different countries in Central America. So in this case, there is a significant fishery, in this case tuna fisheries, associated with the Costa Rica Dome, and there is interest by the Central American countries to start managing this important area, even though it's beyond the national jurisdictions of the Central American countries. So I think that we face the same issues that David and Guillermo were mentioning. We are dealing with the aftermath of an arbitrary boundary that divide an interconnected world, which is the ocean, into easy and high seas. These arbitrary boundaries have separated gyres of whaling systems from the riverine states in terms of jurisdictional and managerial issues, and it has the tremendous impact on how the countries benefit from those important systems, which demand a lot of information on what are the linkages between these high systems and the coastal economies of the riverine countries. So this is something that I think that we will have to address very specifically in the upcoming years, establishing and highlighting the relevance that the high sea system has in the coastal economies. And the other important issue that I want to address in the context of the Costa Rican DOM is, do not underestimate the investment necessary on awareness. We are talking about something that a lot of the population do not understand, and for them, oceans is a holiday issue. It's something that is important only in the holidays. And talking about something that is happening 300 miles offshore is even more irrelevant for them. So we are developing a new conception of the world. So awareness, information has to be very important category in the activities that we'll have to develop in the upcoming years.
Right. Thank you very much, Jorge. That was very enlightening, and I think it's another good example beyond the Sargasso Sea. I wanted to look at the third place, and maybe I'll direct this to you, Staffan. Looking at the world's largest MPA in the Ross Sea in the Southern Ocean, adjacent to Antarctica, what are the lessons learned we have there for creating this MPA? And is there something that we can bring with us to the treaty from the experiences in the Ross Sea?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think thank you for the question, Carl Gustavo. I mean, we have to realize what a long and concerted effort it was to establish the Ross Sea MPA in the CAMLR context. I think we still have lots of work to do in CAMLR to ensure that we have the proper management plan, and we have a proper research and monitoring plan there, and several other things. But I think one thing we learned was probably that we shouldn't really rest or rest, but it's a long process, and that we need to plan for all these phases that Christina so eloquently shown in the beginning. I think perhaps we when developing the plans, which are also set out in the President's draft, when we're developing these plans, we need to have a plan for all the way to really passing the finishing line along head, not just stopping by the decision of establishment, but really putting effort into producing real-time efficient management and review plans.
Thank you very much, Staffan.
I think there are probably very many more lessons learned to be learned from that process, including that it took some significant political interest to establish it. But
yeah, we were both down there when it was actually finally decided, and we'd been there a few years, and it was certainly not an easy process. And I think it's fair to say that if John Kerry hadn't called up the Russian leadership and pushed for this, it would not have happened. And I think we'll see this across the globe also, that we need people to show political leadership to really move the needle in the right direction. And we're still a long ways away, and this is not how people consider winning votes. So it'll be a struggle, but the good news is I think a lot of people are increasingly waking up to the fact that this planet is in trouble, and we need to address a number of the big challenges that we see ahead of us. So, Guillermo, I have gotten another question here, which I thought was perhaps interesting for you. So one idea that you were mentioning is the 4-dimensional ABMTs in marine protected areas, and how you would go about creating them using the different types of data that you have available. Could you give us, if there are any examples of where we established such areas successfully, either is outside of in the high seas or potentially perhaps more within EEZs? So we'll see an example of where it's actually working well and that you think would be a model that one could look at.
Yes, of course. Thanks for the question. I think there's a few examples of implemented tools that are able to account for all 4 spatial temporal dimensions. The examples that have been published on dynamic ocean management, which were I showed on one of my slides, are proof that we can track the distribution of non-target species such as loggerhead sea turtles in the North Pacific or southern bluefin tuna off the east coast of Australia in ways that are communicated in near real time to the fishing community to avoid bycatch events. What initially seems like a purely conservation focused effort is also very beneficial to the sector. In the case of the North Pacific turtle example, it's a tool called Turtle Watch, and it helps the Hawaii longline fleet avoid bycatch events of 2 species of sea turtle that, if took place beyond a certain number, would lead to the immediate closure of the fleet. So these are not only tools to ensure conservation, but also to help industry avoid negative impacts that could affect their interests in the near future. So there's only a handful of examples. I don't know of any that are established and implemented and enforced in the high seas. But I know that one of the tuna RFMOs is taking decisive steps towards including this type of dynamism in the Pacific Ocean, actually. So hopefully we'll see some of these sectoral bodies, and perhaps the IMO would also make sense, assimilate a lot of information that is necessary for this type of management, develop the tools, bring the stakeholders to the table, and show why this is a win-win type of tool that could help industry burn less fuel, reduce bycatch, and return back home to their families sooner. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jorge.
Yes, I just would like to add that during the last years, different organizations have been concentrated efforts in 2 case studies, the Sargasso Sea and the Costa Rica Dome, precisely in recognition of the need to develop specific examples of how to handle these variables, these studies, these different methodologies, not even mentioned yet governance issues, to specific high seas areas. And I think that is very important to highlight, because we really need examples, specific examples of things that can be done and show that they can be done. And I hope that in the upcoming years, these 2 sites will be good examples of that possibility.
Thank you very much. So I now have a question for maybe for David or Christina. There is the Nauru type agreement that was established, and it's sort of trying to address things like these areas that are within a pocket of exclusive economic zones. Are there any possibilities of using that more broadly in other places like the Arctic donut hole or other areas? Any thoughts about that, David and yeah?
Okay, I'll start if I may. And I'm sorry, I got bumped off twice, so I had to come back in, so I missed
not biased here, I can assure you, but sorry about that.
No, it's just I had to call in and my line got broken off. So if that happens, that's me not taking my back home. It's could I just add some little comment about dynamism in relation to Sargasso Sea, just to follow up what Jorge said, and that is, you know, it is by nature a dynamic system. It's the area that we designated as our collaboration is 2 million square miles. So we're not necessarily saying that should be closed, but there are various times of the year when particularly the convergence zone, which is a lot of spawning takes place and activity, those areas change, and those change year by year as well as during the time. So, you know, that's another example. That ICAT actually does have a seasonal closure in the Gulf of Guinea, which is a quite important dynamic system as well. Right, so Nauru. So the idea of the Nauru Agreement, which was really a subset of those South Pacific countries, which are parties to the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Agreement, is really to control fishing within their EEZs. And those countries, I know 5 of them, aren't there, have actually strongly controlled the fishing within their EEZ. But if in order to take advantage of their accessing their waters, vessels that want to take advantage of that and have licenses mustn't fish in the high seas areas, pockets between them. So that's quite an interesting, innovative approach to a high seas governance, if you like, by using negative space. So I think that's a possible approach where a small group of countries that might work in the Arctic have actually taken a view in relation to particular stocks. But the Arctic also already is a small group, and they've also have concluded this important agreement on on suspending. It's not a total ban, but it's a suspension of all fishing in that area for some time. So they've already made some progress on that front, I think.
Perfect. Christina.
Hi, just to point out that the Nauru Agreement is a really important achievement in the Pacific, but it's for a discrete enclosed area of the high seas where vessels have to pass through the exclusive economic zones to get there. The situation in the Arctic is quite different, that there is no closed off straits, is my understanding, and it's much more of a high seas commons. And so there is just an interesting article by Vishglanen, Berkman, and Oren Young talking about sort of what can we learn from the Arctic for the BB&J agreement is, yes, the adjacent states, you can use that term, or the proximate states, do have a distinct responsibility, but it's not solely their responsibility for the high seas segment. And this becomes the responsibility of all, and why the Arctic 5 included other states in this closing the high seas, the high seas fishing freeze, let's call it, because it can't just be a few states if you want it to be applicable to all states as a whole. So you need that leadership, you need that initiative to say, we're going to do this, and we encourage and create incentives. And the other thing we can learn from the Nauru Agreement is that market states, ports do matter. You can enforce this agreement through erecting port state restrictions, market state restrictions. It's not just what happens on the high seas. Thanks.
Thank you. And while I have you there, we were also asked a little bit of you. Could you expand how countries who are currently engaged in RFMOs can be involved in this process? So, you know, the RFMO states that are active, can they also take on responsibility when it comes to marine conservation?
Well, we certainly hope so. And one of the ideas that some of us have been considering is, could the RFMOs be charged with creating a biodiversity action plan and strategy, actually doing an assessment of where they're having an impact on biodiversity? Similarly, for the International Maritime Organization, the IMO was charged with actually identifying sensitive areas back in 1978, and instead they sort of opted for this more case-by-case approach of particularly sensitive sea areas. So states who are RFMOs need to start at the national level, coordinating their policies and making sure that their members who go to the fisheries organizations have a conservation mandate, have an ecosystem-based mandate. But likewise, states who are not going to the RFMOs can work through the Global Conference of Parties to both invite and request these regional RFMOs members to tell them what's going on at the RFMO. What are you doing in order to help protect biodiversity? What measures have you adopted? It needs to be a two-way street. And the problem is the RFMOs are composed of states with an economic interest in the fisheries. Only CAMLAR actually allows states who have even a scientific interest. That's still a significant economic requirement. The high seas belongs to us all and needs to be managed for the benefit of all. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Staffan, you're the only representative of a government here. Do the Swedish government or EU, for example, have views on this?
views on RFMO and
well, maybe I widen the question a little bit. How do you get a broader engagement on this treaty, and how do you make sure that all parties and all people have a say in how this is constructed, and that it actually represents their interests in a way?
Well, as we have seen today, I mean, it's not a void out there. It's there are many organizations, environmentally tasked or fisheries tasked or shipping tasked, and obviously they will need to be on board, and they will need to have a role within this agreement. I think that the interesting thing I think is to reflect on is in areas where there is no suitable mandate for measures, how do we do it there? I think that discussion is equally interesting as who can be part in where there is a mandate.
Okay, and Guillermo, you have some thoughts about this also.
Yeah, certainly. Just following up on these two points, I think it's important to remind coastal and island nations who perhaps have been a little bit less engaged or interested in what happens beyond 200 nautical miles, to remember that I think it's Annex 1 of the law of the sea that lists migratory species, and there's about 100 of them that were identified back in the 80s and 90s, and now I think we're up to 850 or so migratory or straddling species across taxonomic groups. Many of those species migrate to each and every coastal and island nation in the world, and whatever happens to those migratory straddling species in the high seas will affect the ecosystems domestically. And as it stands, not to pick on anyone per se, but I don't think any of the tuna RFMOs have ABMTs designed to reduce bycatch. Not a single one after many decades of RFMOs. That is not to say they couldn't start implementing them, but right now, any impact on any of these 850 straddling species in the high seas are not accounted for, and the people who are going to end up paying the price are coastal and island states, and perhaps some of those that are right now not as engaged as they should be. So I would encourage coastal communities and states and indigenous peoples who have a lot of stake at the table to realize this. But at the same time, we depend on data that is not being shared. That knowledge is not always accessible. So it's a chicken and an egg sort of argument, but I can promise you that we could be doing a lot more to also protect our coastal communities.
Thank you. So we've also gotten questions in about financing. How do we actually create a system which permits us to generate some revenue from somewhere, so that we're not sort of looking at subsidies or grants to maintain things like the Sargasso Sea Commission or whatever else management bodies we might have for area-based management tools over time. And one idea that was floated here is to see, is there a possibility of getting rent from some of these activities, either be it from the fishing industry or from other users of the high seas like the shipping industry or seabed miners or something like this. So do you have any views on how would one go about that? Anyone who want to volunteer a little bit of how do we finance this? I mean, we might have a dedicated another session where we look at this, but for this point, more specifically on ABMTs, it might be interesting to hear your suggestions on that. David.
Yeah, I'll have a shot. It's a difficult one, right? I mean, I made this point about financing. We've been the beneficiaries of a number of philanthropists, who particularly the late Richard Rockefeller, who actually was very committed to this and put a lot of his own money, and that of many of his colleagues as well. So we've had a number of supporters, important supporters. We've now got a GF grant, but it's taken us, and this is the first ever grant we've got, so it's taken us a long time to get support for this. Economists have been talking about user fees for a very long time, right? Even the tuna RFMOs are perennially short of money, despite the huge amounts of money that are made by the operators who are actually taking the resource out. So I think the RFMOs need to start looking at properly funding their activities as well, right? In terms of the profits that are made by from these activities, so starting to do this from scratch in relation to new organizations will be very difficult. But we do have financial mechanisms for the other big environmental agreements like the Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Convention, and mechanism utilizing perhaps the GF at least, or I don't know how even the Green Climate Fund might be a possibility, but there are other sort of funding mechanisms. What I'm getting at is that it's very difficult to start this operation from scratch. So are we going to be dependent on the benevolence of a number of countries or who are interested in supporting this, or independent philanthropists? There should be some form of funding mechanism which should be organized, which would be sensible to organize at a global level. And answer the question, but addresses some of the problems of it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Christina.
I think the resource rent question is something that we will need to discuss into the future. I know that in the seabed mining world, the contractors are expected to share the benefits, the revenue stream. Marine genetic resources, we're talking about sharing the revenue stream, part of it. And the question is, high seas freedoms has traditionally not included actually paying for access to these services. But as there are more and more users in greater demand, is it something that it's timely to consider? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Jorge? No? No? Okay. Guillermo.
Thank you, Carl. The only thing the way I would approach this is not how much money could be made necessarily, but how much money is being lost annually by, let's say, ecotourism operators, with estimated 300,000 marine mammals dying every year because of negative interactions in the high seas, or in the global ocean actually, or sea turtles or seabirds, and we could go on. So what is the cost of some of these ecosystem services in the coastal ocean being eroded because of what happens in the high seas? And I don't think there's many studies out there that have provided a satisfactory answer to this question, but it is certainly happening. The degree to which, I don't know, but we're currently losing ecosystem services because of our lack of action beyond the 200 nautical mile boundary.
Thank you. And Stefan, finally.
Yes, I was just wanting to make the connection to capacity building here as well, because it's not just good data and good science this body or this instrument will have access to. It's also important for wide participation and ensure that benefits could and should be spread. So capacity building is central to this part of the agreement as it is to the other parts.
Can I just quickly come back and just say that the financial question is significant, and long-term needs contributions, great thought from everybody, voluntary, industry, science. We're getting a lot of in-kind contributions already, but we could certainly step up. We need some long-term initiatives. Thanks.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in lots of it will follow, what form we put also. If we're going to have new institutions, then there needs to be a dedicated mechanism for them. If it's existing ones, it might be that one could lean on the existing funders of them and find some mechanism or sharing the costs of it. And then, of course, in as much as there is a benefit and we actually are increasing and improving the management, there might be some potential small rent there, but I don't think we should be overexcited about that possibility. Presumably, it's not going to be that great. And I think addressing things like freedom of shipping and things like this, it's not like we're going to take tolls of people spending X amount of time. I mean, we're not on a toll road here. So I think one needs to be quite modest in terms of how you think about that also. Now, another possibility is actually to go after the illegal parties and make sure that you get them to pay. But, that is a somewhat more negative thing. But in as much as you impounded vessels and things like that, you could possibly generate a certain amount of revenue from those type of activities. So that might considerably be another angle to look at. But as I mentioned, I think we're interested in having another more dedicated session on more broadly, how do we fund this treaty and what's the institutional arrangements, and perhaps also looking at the broader capacity building and how do we share benefits between developed and developing countries in this context. And all of those, I think, are going to be central to getting a treaty that everyone can be happy with and at least accept at some level. So that will be a challenge, and that's obviously what many of us are working on to try to accomplish. Now, I see that we've run over time already, so rather than address any further questions, I just wanted to give a chance to our speakers and panelists to perhaps say any parting words relatively briefly within a minute or so, and before we close this session. So should we start with you, Guillermo? Do you have a couple of points?
Sure. I mean, I think everyone understands the significance of these negotiations, and it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do things right. And in the context of area-based management tools, the open ocean is very dynamic, it's very complex, but thankfully we now have the science to do a better job at managing the open ocean than tools that could be applied to the coastal ocean. So I would encourage ambition. I would encourage engagement with the scientific community. Science doesn't have all the answers, but it can provide tools and means. And if anyone has any questions, I would be more than happy to answer or point in the right direction to those who have the answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Jorge. You're still muted, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I just probably will mention 3 points. I think it's very important to move away from the 19th century cartography and try to take the opportunity to do this thing right, because it's an important decision that is going to last for centuries to come. And I think we already have the understanding and the capacity to actually do this right and have dynamic nature incorporated within the upcoming activities in the high seas. I think that also is very important to analyze the cost of not doing anything. I think it's much higher than the cost of maintaining a system in the high seas. And we need that information to forward. We need to expose those numbers and see what is the cost of not doing anything in the high seas at this moment, how much it's costing the countries and not only the adjacent countries, but countries even far away from the high seas spots that we're looking at. And again, I think it's very important to show the economical linkage between the high seas and the local economies. Many of the ministers that I talk with, this is the first question that they ask me: why is this important for me and for our economy? And I think that we need those answers to be there with robust information backing them up.
Thank you so much. Christina.
Hi, thank you. Just to echo what my colleagues have already said, but then to say that this is an opportunity to try to be creative, flexible, and nimble to evolve our international legal mechanisms for cooperation to confront current and future challenges. What we need are really those ways to bring people together, to bring the best available science, but most importantly, to take action now on what we know are the priorities for conservation. We've been working on the CBD ecologically or biologically significant areas. Those could be a first look at where you want to go with high seas, marine protected areas, while we build out these platforms for multi-stakeholder cooperation. It's really essential that the ocean is changing. We have an opportunity to build resilience and to promote productivity that all will benefit from into the future. Thanks.
Thank you. And then maybe Staffan.
Yeah, thank you. Well, basically, I think that you have very well demonstrated the need for such an instrument, and that we need such an instrument to establish measures to protect biodiversity in this area beyond national jurisdiction. So there's absolutely no doubt that that's needed, and we will need to do it in a relatively short period of time. We cannot drag it out too long. So even though it might be a little bit imperfect, for instance, such as Guillermo shown in terms of dynamic features, I think it will be things to add on and things to complement over time. But it was a very useful suggestion, of course. But I think it's the need to walk the walk is now.
Thank you very much. And then the final comment from David.
Right. Well, what a burden to put on my shoulders. I'm very flattered. Thank you. And of course, I was going to say exactly what Guillermo uses, but it's the chance of a generation, and it is. You know, we rightly regard the Law of the Sea Convention, which took 9 years, remember, to negotiate once they even established the process, as being pretty well the ground rules. But there are a lot of gaps in it still, and this is what we're talking about. I think we've got a lot of 30 years of experience of this, and we've supplemented it already in a couple of ways by implementing agreements. So there are some, you know, some obvious lacuna, gaps in the system that we need to address. And I think we've identified a lot of them today. So I think that's been tremendous. I agree with Stefan to a point that we need to get it done, but I think we've got the opportunity, because of, you know, the fact that we're all talking virtually, we're an opportunity to sit back a little bit and think about where we got with this negotiation. And let's not run into an agreement which doesn't address all these things. Let's make sure that we use this time to actually come up with a slightly more flexible agreement that will actually address the issues that we have been talking about today. So thank you very much for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to all of the speakers and panelists for excellent, and thank you to all of those attending who also helped us with a number of very interesting and motivating questions. And so I started out saying we'd be very happy to hear if you would like us to do other webinars like this. What kind of topics, what kind of questions would you like to have addressed, so that we can help the people who are tasked with the tough assignment of developing a wonderful treaty that will benefit future generations. So from my perspective, this has been a really good and enlightening opportunity to address this. I've been keenly following this for a number of years, and I think we are getting to a point here where we can really make a huge difference in the world. I mean, we really have the opportunity. It's within our grasp to address this issue. We know there will be stumbling blocks. We know there's a number of sticky issues that need to be agreed. But the good news is, you know, if there's a will to address this, this is actually quite doable. And I'm optimistic that we will be able to do so. I would encourage all of you who are attending to talk to your governments, if you're not from the government yourself, and encourage them to really focus on this issue, because we need their participation. We need their activities right now. If they're not engaging, we will not get there. And as we saw with the Ross Sea, political leadership is going to be key. Right now, that might not seem like what we have in most supply around the world, but I'm sure we can find opportunities to work with many like-minded governments who really want to make this happen. So I would encourage you all to go out and speak to the people that you think are in the negotiations, who are interested in these type of topics. And if there are technical issues or if there are other challenges you would like to have addressed, let us know. And as IUCN, we're committed to working on this topic. And I just highlight, for those of you who might want to know a little bit more about this topic, this is a publication we recently put out on. You can get it on the IUCN website, and you're more than welcome to download it. There's a short 4-pager, and there's a little bit longer report also, which stress tests the idea of having these area-based management tools in the high seas, and, you know, how would you go about it? And I think we have a lot of our best experts in the world addressing this issue, and so we are making some progress on that. So with that, I would like to thank all of you, and we're looking forward to seeing you on the next one. Goodbye.